talk about the lead up to the Six-Day War, but to begin, we're going to go back to the Suez Crisis of 1956. We're going to remember what the world looks like, or what the Middle East at least looks like, after that Suez Crisis. We've got the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is rising in prominence and certainly rising in stature as an Arab leader, not just an Egyptian leader, but as a leader of pan-Arab nationalism. We talked about how in 1958, Egypt and Syria would unite in what is ultimately going to be a short-lived union of those two states to become the United Arab Republic. But, of course, when it's formed, we don't know that it's going to be short-lived. We remember that the Egyptian forces don't do particularly well in the Suez Crisis. But as the United States and the Soviet Union pressure the British and the French and the Israelis to get out of Egypt, Nasser can stand as a guy that, and he can take credit for driving these Western powers out of his nation. So his stature is on the rise. Also, in the aftermath of the 1956 Suez Crisis, we have the installation of a United Nations emergency force along the border between Egypt and Israel. And that's actually going to be on Egyptian territory in the Sinai. So the United Nations will put in a peacekeeping force called the UNEF in Egypt. The one catch there was the UNEF can only be in Egypt at Egypt's wishing. So as soon as Egypt doesn't want the United Nations in Egypt anymore, they got to go. And then finally, we had that essentially a threat by Golda Meir, foreign minister for Israel, that if the Straits of Tiran were ever to be closed again, as they were in the lead up to the Suez Crisis, if the Straits of Tiran, that narrow waterway opening up to the Gulf of Aqaba into the southern tip of Israel, if the Straits of Tiran were ever closed again, then that would be seen as an act of war by Egypt. And that would lead to a conflict with Israel. So don't close the Straits of Tiran. So in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis, a lot of the situation remains relatively the same. You've got an Israel in existence. You've got a Palestinian refugee crisis still in existence. You've got severe animosity between Israel and its Arab neighbors still in existence. The one difference now, though, is we have a United Nations peacekeeping force implanted into Egypt. I'm going to talk for a moment about an organization, the beginnings of the organization of Palestinian guerrilla movements. This man is named Yasser Arafat. He's a name you need to know for the Arab-Israeli conflict story. Yasser, Y-A-S-S-E-R, Arafat, A-R-A-F-A-T, Yasser Arafat. And in fact, like this symbol, like you guys may see a political cartoon, and Yasser Arafat may appear in it, and he will be a guy that looks relatively like this, but you will recognize this headdress that he wears called the kafaya, which today, for Israelis, the kafaya is a symbol of Yasser Arafat, essentially, and for a long time in this history, Yasser Arafat's support of violent action against the State of Israel. This became, I remember, I want to say back 10 years ago or so, Rachel Ray, you know, she's like the cook, she got a television show, I believe. She was featured on some magazine or another where she was wearing a kafaya, but kind of as a scarf around her neck, not on her head, but she was just kind of wearing it as a fashion statement. And it's kind of become a fashion statement, like you see. Not so much in America. We're not as big on the scarves. But Europeans, they love their scarves. So Rachel Ray was featured in this magazine wearing this kafaya around her neck, and the Israeli Defense League and other organizations that are pro-Israel called out and condemned Rachel Ray for this fashion statement that they were making, because in their eyes it was making a statement in support of the Palestinian movement and Yasser Arafat. But anyway, so this still pops up in the news every once in a while. This is Yasser Arafat. In 1957, Yasser Arafat is going to become a founding member of a group called Fatah. F-A-T-A-H. Fatah, which comes from an Arabic word meaning conquest, was meant to be an organization of these Fedayeen guerrillas. We had talked about since 1949. Palestinians had been going across the border, in some cases bringing violence to Israel. Israel had used their military to suppress these actions. But there was no organization, there was no semblance of Palestinians actually coordinating with each other on how these attacks would go down. That organization begins with Yasser Arafat and what is known as the Fatah movement. Now today, Fatah is a part of the Palestinian Authority. It's essentially a political party today. But it had at its origins the attempts to organize the guerrilla movements against Israel. Shortly after, by 1964, Egypt and Gamal Abdel Nasser get behind the support of another Palestinian group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. This is organized in 1964 in a conference in Cairo, and this is Nasser's attempt to oversee actions by the Fedayeen guerrilla Palestinians. Nasser wants to be a leader of the Arab movement, right? Not just Egyptians. The Palestinian fight is one of the most important fights within the Arab movement. And so Nasser wanted to have his hands in on that. The PLO, and you guys read some excerpts from their constitution, their goal, they claim Palestine as a state of their own, and they see armed struggle against Israel as a means to get that state. And so now attacks from Palestinians will be coordinated and organized in many cases by this new PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, Yasser Arafat, where he is going to become far more prominent, is when Fatah becomes absorbed into the PLO. The Fatah movement essentially gets wrapped into the PLO, and eventually Yasser Arafat will be the leader of the PLO itself. This is important to note, because the PLO is not a state, all right? There is no state of Palestine or anything. The PLO is fighting for a state, but they're not a state. Whereas all of the other countries that are like fighting against the existence or the expansion of Israel, whether it be Syria or Egypt or any others, those are states. And states, for example, have rules that they must play by. And the United Nations exists, and these countries are members of the United Nations. The PLO, in its origins at least, it's not a member state, and it's not a member of the United Nations. They'll eventually get observer status, but they're not there yet. So it works a little differently than other states. For example, if Egypt is supporting attacks against Israel, or Syria is supporting attacks against Israel, the United Nations can condemn that and can levy economic sanctions against a group like Egypt or against a nation like Syria. But if it's coming from the PLO, that is not a state, that's a little bit more challenging to deal with, right? And you can see why a guy like Nasser would put his support behind a group like that. Beyond the Palestinian movement, we're going to start to see some more political controversy between Israel and Syria. In 1961, there's going to be a coup in Syria, an overthrowing of the government that had aligned itself with Egypt in that United Arab Republic. This coup is going to come from a political organization known as the Ba'ath Party. And that's B-A with an apostrophe, A-T-H. This is the same political organization that still runs Syria to this day. It's the same political party if you've ever read anything about Iraq during Saddam Hussein's reign. So the Baathists are a political movement in Syria and then in Iraq. They break, yes sir?
So was that when Hafez al-Assad took power in Syria?
I believe there was someone before him, but it's certainly the same family line. He might not have been he may have been the first, might not have been the first, I don't know. with the rise of the Baathists in power in Syria, we start to see an escalation between Syria and Israel in terms of violent actions. Yes, ma'am.
So is the coup in Syria leads to the dissolution of the UAR?
Yeah, the UAR is no longer, but Egypt and Syria will still have a relationship. We'll talk about it in a moment. Having Israel as an enemy, having Israel as like the bad guy for the Syrian government, is good for the Syrian government, right? Because it can deflect a lot of like issues that Syrians might have onto the nation of Israel. So a lot of government propaganda is going to be coming out to try to harness any frustrations or anger that the Syrian people might have to direct them against the nation of Israel. Because if we're directing people's anger towards Israel, it might not be directed towards their own government. All right? So Syria and Israel are going to become greater adversaries as the 60s press on. Much of this starts with the Jordan River. Now, we'll talk about this map at a later date, but the Jordan River forms most of the border between the West Bank and the nation of Jordan and northern Israel and Jordan. The Jordan River has its headwaters in Syria to the north. In 1966, Syria begins to build some damming projects on the Jordan River headwaters. If you dam up a river, it's going to restrict water flow downriver, right? And so this is threatening to the nation of Israel. This threatens an important water source for Israel. So as Syria begins to move to create a water diversion for the Jordan River, Israel can't have that. So the Israelis start to fire artillery rounds at this dam project. Syrians respond in turn by firing shots into Israel from the Golan Heights, which is a highland region at the border between Syria and Israel. But it's Syrian territory. At the same time, Egypt and Syria will sign a mutual defense pact. So they're not related anymore in the United Arab Republic, but they do sign a defensive agreement. Meaning if anybody attacks Egypt, if anybody attacks Egypt, Syria defends. If anybody attacks Syria, Egypt defends. While at the same time, we get this escalation in tensions between Israel and Syria. In 1966 as well, a couple MiG fighters from Syria. Now, if the Syrians are having MiG fighters, McCoy and Gurevich, where are those planes from? Those are Soviet planes. Same kind of planes that were being sold to the Indians in the Sino-Indian War. In 1966, a couple Syrian MiGs fly over this body of water. This is called the Sea of Galilee, if you are steeped in Christian tradition. This is called Lake Tiberias by others. A couple Syrian MiGs fly over this lake and start opening fire on some Israeli Coast Guard. Israel will shoot down a couple of these planes. Ultimately, Syria backs down and they stop the construction project to dam up the Jordan River. But tensions are now at an extreme point. And we need to make note of what Egypt doesn't do during this time. You've got an escalation in violence between Syria and Israel, and Egypt is not doing anything. Egypt is sitting back. They have a defensive agreement with Syria. Now, technically, Syria hasn't been invaded, and there's no war that's been declared. But Egypt has done nothing. And this begins to harm Nasser's reputation in the Arab world. Because Nasser was once talking a big game about pushing Israel back. And now when he has a chance to put his money where his mouth is, he's not reacting. And then, to add insult to injury for Nasser, what again is located between him and the nation of Israel? United Nations peacekeepers, United Nations emergency force. So it's beginning, perception means a lot, right? It's beginning to look like Nasser is simply not reacting because he's got the United Nations between him, because he's safe from Israel, whereas other Arab nations might be falling victim. Tensions will escalate not only with Syria, but also with Jordan. Now remember, after the 1948 war, Jordan is going to occupy the West Bank territory. Jordan controls that. It's a part of Jordan. But Jordan has got tremendous issues with its own Palestinian population. Many of them are refugees. Remember the beginning of the refugee crisis back in 1948 and 49. Many of those refugees are living in the West Bank. And of those refugees, some of them are taking part in guerrilla actions. They're Fedayeen, crossing, now being organized by the PLO, crossing the border into Israel and bringing violence into Israel. Now, make note of this. When it comes, use this map for a second. When it comes to border infiltrations in 1966, do we think most of them will be coming across this border in the West Bank to Israel? Or the southern border from Egypt into Israel? Why West Bank? Because there's no UN there. UN is down here. You can't do as many infiltrations down there now. They're going to be coming from the West Bank. So in response to Fedayeen raids coming from the West Bank, yes, sir?
Was that UN force in Gaza too, or just?
They went up into Gaza, yes. In response to a Fedayeen infiltration, in response to Fedayeen raids, the Israeli Defense Force will go into a Jordanian West Bank town, village, called Samu, S-A-M-U. These are known as the Samu raids. In the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces will destroy some buildings, and in the end, 18 Palestinians will be dead. This is like a long-term traditional response from the Israelis targeting the areas where the Fedayeen come from. The king of Jordan is in a horrible position. The king of Jordan is in a horrible position. This is actually the origins of being caught between a rock and a hard space, because the king of Jordan was caught between Iraq and Israel. And also, no, this is just stupid. I'm making that up. But he's literally between Iraq and Israel. And he's caught between a rock and a hard place. Because at one point, the king of Jordan knows that if he were to respond to these Israeli attacks into his territory, that his military cannot defeat the military of Israel. He knows that. He doesn't want to go to war against Israel. But he also knows that if he doesn't react against this invasion, if he doesn't react, who's going to be mad at him in Jordan? The Palestinians in Jordan, of which there are hundreds of thousands, because that's where most of the refugees from the 48 war went. And in fact, does King Hussein of Jordan have any family history that tells him to be wary of angry Palestinians? We mentioned last week what happened to his grandfather. Assassinated. King Abdullah of Jordan, following the 1948 war, was assassinated by a Palestinian terrorist. So King Hussein has got to take note of what's going on. So on one hand, he could attack Israel in retribution, but he would lose. If he does nothing against Israel, he's going to have an angered Palestinian population that's going to want his head. Tough situation to be in. Yes, ma'am?
So, King Hussein isn't like Nasser, like he isn't supporting these infiltrations?
He's not supporting it. He doesn't want it, because he doesn't want beef with Israel. He shares a very important border with Israel, arguably even more important than the border with Egypt. If we go back to this map again, look at the border of the West Bank. Looks a little harder to defend that than this border between Egypt and Israel, right? Plus, much of this is like urban territory. And they've got the city of Jerusalem divided in half. None of this was territory that Jordan was originally meant to have. Remember, that was territory that was supposed to have been a part of the original Palestinian state, which never came to be. So Jordan, the king of Jordan, is perfectly happy holding on to that land and holding on to the eastern part of Jerusalem. But doing nothing against Israeli attacks on his villages is going to anger the Palestinians in his country. But all the while, Gamal Abdel Nasser does nothing. So you've got Syria, an Arab nation, in armed conflict with Israel. Nasser does nothing. Now you have Jordan, an Arab nation, in armed conflict with Israel. And Nasser does nothing. Nasser is not looking like that Arab Superman that he once wanted to be, right? And with the United Nations emergency forces along that Egyptian-Israeli border, Nasser is looking like all talk. In 1967, war will come. There's a few reasons that historians will give as to why this war ultimately happens. And I'll lay them out for you because there's probably truth in all of them. First, we've got Arab leaders like Nasser himself who want to be seen as the leader in Arab affairs. And being strong against Israel can help assert that position. Another reason we're going to have war in 67 is you've got the rising threat of the Palestinian guerrilla movement, like the PLO. The PLO is now organized. They're now better funded with support from Egypt. And they're executing more attacks and more coordinated attacks against Israel. Israel can't let this continue. Israel is also pushing towards the development of a nuclear weapon. Now, the year is 1967 that we're talking about. By this time, the United States and the Soviet Union and China are nuclear powers. I think France and Britain are in there as well at that time. So there are a number of nuclear powers around the world. Israel is fast working on the development of their own nuclear weapon. Now, fast forward to today, Israel absolutely has nuclear weapons today. They have never publicly admitted it, though. But we know Israel hasn't. So they're working on them in 1967. Yes, sir?
When was the proliferation treaty that banned countries like making nukes?
That I don't know off the top of my head. You can Google it and let me know. So Israel is working on their own nuclear weapon. Egypt does not want the Israelis to have a nuclear weapon because having a nuclear weapon means what? They can't be toppled anymore. Once Israel gets a nuclear weapon, the thoughts of defeating Israel in war, the thoughts of invading Israel in war are going to go by the wayside. Yes, sir?
Oh, it was only a year after the 67 war.
That they ultimately developed, yeah.
They signed it. I mean,
That they signed it. They signed it? Okay. So, once Israel would get a nuclear weapon, that's going to change the narrative. So, Egypt needs to move before the Israelis get that nuclear weapon. Israel, for its own part, has desire to expand its territory. The right wing of Israeli politics, now occupied by a political party called Likud, L-I-K-U-D. And these are the successors to those revisionists we talked about. When they look at a map of Israel, they see this. They see this. All of this green should be the nation of Israel, including the Palestinian territories. They believe that the original plan for Israel was not the homeland in Palestine that the Balfour Declaration talked about, but a homeland of Palestine. So that it would include the West Bank and certainly include all of Jerusalem. So you've got some desire. Now, this is not across the board in Israeli politics, but some within the Israeli political system that want to see the expansion of Israeli territory. And then we've got a Cold War story. You've got the Soviet Union involved, who wants greater relationships with Arab nations. Arab nations who have borders like Egypt on the Mediterranean Sea. The Soviet Union being friendly with Egypt, for example, can give the Soviet Union that warm water access on the Mediterranean Sea that Russia has long desired. And then on the American side, you've got a growing relationship between the United States and the nation of Israel, in the sense that since the Kennedy administration in 1960 election, and then later Johnson, both of those political parties, or both of those political candidates, have tried to emphasize their support for an Israeli nation to assist in having Jewish American groups put their support behind them. You guys might have noticed last week, I believe, there was a major convention of the largest American-Israeli Political Action Committee, where most of the every political candidate, except for Bernie Sanders, went to this Political Action Committee convention and spoke about how they are supportive of the nation of Israel. And they are all, Republican and Democrat alike, or at least Hillary Clinton and all the Republican nominees alike, looking for the support from this Political Action Committee, because it is a politically vibrant and energetic organization. They put a lot of money and they put a lot of support behind political candidates. So you've got a closer America and Israel. You've got a closer Egypt and Syria and the Soviet Union. You've got Nasser wanting to be seen as a leader of the Arab world. You've got Israelis demanding more territory. You got a lot of reasons going down for a war to come. War will ultimately come in 1967. First, you've got continued Palestinian guerrilla activities along the border. In April of 1967, Syrian artillery fires upon an Israeli tractor in the north of Israel. And the Israelis return fire. And now again, you've got Israelis and Syrians firing at each other in the north of the country. Syrians scramble their jets in April of 1967 and do a flyover of Israeli territory. Syrians fire at Israel, Israel returns fire. Syria scrambles some of their MiGs. Israel shoots them down. And then the Israeli Air Force does a buzz over Damascus. They fly over Damascus, the capital of Syria. They don't do anything, they don't drop any bombs, but it's a symbol of what could come if Syria doesn't back down. And then the Soviets step in. The Soviet ambassador to Egypt passes information off to the Egyptians that the Israelis are prepping for an invasion of Syria. Okay, this sounds very convoluted and confusing, and I want to give you guys a couple words of encouragement here. There's a lot going on, but here's what the IB would do with a 1967 question, all right, about the 67 war. They'd give you 5 sources. 2 would be primary, 2 would be secondary, 1 would be a cartoon of some sort, or a drawing, or a map, or an image. And they will give you a little background. And then the documents will help remind you a lot of this stuff is going on. So please don't feel like you have to have an encyclopedic memory of everything that I'm talking about right here, okay? It's going to look just like that. Please don't feel that you have to have an encyclopedic memory of everything that we've talked about. But if you know the general narrative, that's cool to go. Okay, you're going to be good for paper 1.
So as long as we know, like, things just escalate?
Absolutely. If you know escalation, we're good to go. So the Soviet Union passes information to Egypt that Israel is getting ready to attack Syria. This was a lie. This was made up. This was fabricated. This was false. Not true. We don't know to this day why the Soviet Union did what they did. There's speculation for a couple different reasons. Maybe the Soviet Union passed this misinformation off because they wanted to convince the Egyptians that they were not ready for a real war against Israel. And if they weren't ready for a war against Israel, what would they have to do? They'd have to get in tighter with the Soviets. They would have to get in closer with the Soviets, make more deals with the Soviets, and that could benefit the Soviet Union in the long run. So you've got that. Maybe that's a reason. Or maybe the Soviets didn't want anything to do with a war in the Middle East, and they were hoping that the Egyptians would get the Syrians to calm down. If the Egyptians got the Syrians to calm down and de-escalate, maybe a greater conflict could be avoided. Ultimately, we don't know what the Soviets were up to. But their message to Egypt absolutely forces the issue. Yes, sir?
So when did the Egyptians figure out that it was a lie?
Not until afterwards, I would imagine. Yeah, they're going to push forward. In May of 1967, on May 15th, Nasser is going to send 100,000 troops into the Sinai Peninsula. Here's the Sinai Peninsula. This is Egypt. Or this is Israel, pardon me. Sinai Peninsula. They're going to send 100,000 troops into the Sinai, along with almost 1,000 tanks, 900 tanks. Yes? The UN forces are there along the border. They're still there. This is Egyptian territory. But this is Nasser mobilizing the Sinai Peninsula. So on May 15th, Nasser sends 100,000 troops and 900 tanks into the Sinai. He's militarizing the Sinai. The next day, Nasser requests that the United Nations evacuate Egypt. He requests that they leave. Now, following these troop movements by Egypt, Israel begins to mobilize for war. The Israeli economy shuts down, and the Israeli Defense Forces call their reserves into action. On May 17th, the next day, this is all happening now very fast, Egyptian jets fly over this nuclear reactor in southern Israel called Dimona, the Dimona nuclear reactor, D-I-M-O-N-A. Egyptian MiGs, again, Egyptian MiGs are getting it from the Soviets, fly over the Dimona reactor. They don't attack it, but they do a flyover. On May 22nd, Nasser closes the Straits of Tiran. Now, we had already said, Golda Meir, after 1956, said that the Straits of Tiran would be a casus belli. Keep them open unless it's an act of war. Nasser calls for the closing of the Straits of Tiran. Yes?
How do you spell Meir?
M-E-I-R. I-M-I-E-R. I before E, Meir. I think M-I-E-R. Meir. M-I-E-R. Closes the Straits of Tiran. So now it's really looking like war is imminent. All right? Question is only going to be now, who is ultimately going to start it? On May 27th, an Israeli foreign minister named Abba Eban, A-B-B-A, first name, Eban, E-B-A-N, goes to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Johnson. Here is a photo of Abba Eban. Here's a photo of Abba Eban speaking with President Johnson. Look at the cloud of smoke. Everybody used to smoke in the 60s. Abba Eban meeting with President Lyndon Johnson in the Oval Office. He's an Israeli foreign minister. Goes to Washington. And he's going to tell Johnson that Israel is in a state of existential crisis. Existential crisis means their existence is at stake here. If they lose this, if war comes, it could be the end of Israel. And so Abba Eban wants help from the United States. He wants help from the United States. Because if the Arab neighbors attack, Israel will be done. Yes, ma'am? May 27th. And you need not memorize these days, just know that they're happening very fast. Abba Eban says to Washington, we need help. We're in an existential crisis here. We're going to be attacked. And we need American support. Now, what does the United States do in May of 1967? This is the Vietnam War. We're in the escalation of the Vietnam War, right? The United States has bigger fish to fry than what's going on in the Middle East. Johnson's response to Abba Eban is, don't fool us. Don't kid us, Israel. I know that you would win any war that you fought against your Arab neighbors. Your military is superior to theirs. You're more organized than they are. We both know that you are in no such existential crisis. So Johnson's message to Abba Eban and the nation of Israel is this: Israel will not be alone in any upcoming war unless they choose to go it alone. Israel will only be alone if Israel starts the war. So if Egypt attacks Israel, the United States will support Israel. If Syria attacks Israel, the United States will support Israel. If Israel launches an attack against its own neighbors, the United States is out, and Israel will stand on their own. This is exactly what Abba Eban and the Israeli nation were looking for. Because what has the United States essentially told Israel? Wait to be attacked if you want American support. But if you attack, will the Americans stop you? No. And that's an important distinction. We say we won't help you if you launch an attack. But by not saying anything else, we essentially tell Israel that we won't stop you if you do attack. Which is big, because what had the United States done in 1956? We stopped the attack. We forced Israel out of the Sinai. This is what's referred to as Johnson's yellow light to Israel. Green light means go. We're going to support you no matter what. Red light means stop. Don't do it. Yellow light means proceed with caution, Israel. Know that if you launch this fight, you're going to be on your own. But that's exactly what Israel wanted to hear. That whatever they do, the Americans won't stop them. All right? Abba Eban goes back to Israel, passes the information off to the Israeli cabinet. On June 4th, the Israeli cabinet decides to support the military plan drawn up by this man. His name is Moshe Dayan, D-A-Y-A-N. He's the Israeli defense minister. And he wears an eye patch, so that just kind of escalates the tough guy look. They approve his plan to attack Egypt in the upcoming days. So Israel is going to start the Six-Day War, the 1967 war. Israel is going to start it. And they're allowed to start it because the United States tells them, we won't stop you. Now, for the Israelis' perspective, they think Egypt is getting ready to attack. Because what has Egypt made it look like they're going to do? They moved troops into the Sinai. They sent the United Nations home. They closed the Straits of Tiran. It looks like Egypt is going to attack. So what Israel is going to be launching is what is considered a preemptive strike. If I think you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you first. So you can't hit me. It's ultimately June 6th that it's gonna get going.
It's like another first strike, isn't it? The first day of Barbarossa. Right?
There you go. Sure. So,
Wait, no, that was D-Day. Never mind.
so this is a preemptive strike. Now here, what's the problem with a preemptive strike? You never really know what Egypt was up to, right? You only have your guesses. And later, historical records have said that Nasser was not going to invade, that he was just trying to flex his muscles and look tougher in the midst of other Arab leaders and other Arab states questioning his position towards Israel. But Israel doesn't know that, and Egypt doesn't know what Israel is going to do. We'll come back in a couple days and we will fight the war.